Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I wish you all a very warm welcome from Nantes for this last event before the closing session of this second edition of FestiWell. With a group of colleagues from the universities of Birmingham, Cologne, Florence, Leiden, Linnaeus, and Nantes, we have been working over the past few months on common research and training projects on environmental humanities, which is still an emerging field in Europe. It is therefore a pleasure to share with you through this conference the contribution that the environmental humanities can make to questions of well-being in times of planetary perils. I am delighted to open this event and introduce our renowned guest speaker today, Dr. Kate Rigby from Bath Spa University in the UK, where she directs the Research Centre for Environmental Humanities together with the associated master's degree and PhD program. And I'm delighted for at least two reasons. The first one is that she has accepted to share her expertise on the subject, which no doubt will bring a very valuable contribution to a broad understanding of well-being. And the second one is that not only has she agreed to join through this conference, but she has also agreed to join the group of teachers and researchers from EUniWell universities who are actually present in Nantes and who will be working over the next 2 days on joint projects around environmental humanities. So I'm therefore particularly happy to greet Kate Rigby and will now hand over to my colleague from Cologne, Roman Bartosz, to introduce her conference. Enjoy the conference.
I am also sending a very, very warm welcome to all colleagues, friends, and participants of the festival from me as well. It is such a pleasure and honor to be part of this exciting event indeed. And it is an even greater pleasure and honor to introduce you all to our speaker this afternoon, who despite her many duties and exciting projects has agreed to join us here for the final of many fascinating lectures, which at the same time is the inaugural lecture of the EUniWell Environmental Humanities Conference, as Sylvie mentioned. And it is also the kickoff lecture for a Cologne-based online lecture series on global environmental humanities, to which you're also all kindly invited. Professor Kate Rigby certainly needs no introduction, but bear with me while I indulge in naming some of her countless achievements for the environmental humanities worldwide. She is a fellow of the Australian Humanities Academy and Alexander von Humboldt Fellow, and she's the founding director of the Research Centre for Environmental Humanities at Bath Spa University, as well as adjunct professor of literary studies at Monash University in Melbourne. She was the inaugural president of the Association for the Study of Literature, Environment and Culture, Australia and New Zealand, and convener of the Australia Pacific Forum on Religion and Ecology at Monash. Moreover, she was founding co-editor of the journal Philosophy, Activism, Nature, and has published 7 books, 2 of them as co-editor, along with numerous articles and book chapters across the fields of German studies, comparative literature, and the environmental humanities. Really too many to name, but I'm just pointing out a beautiful Dancing with Disaster, as well as the most recent Reclaiming Romanticism. Her research lies at the intersection of environmental, literary, philosophical, historical, and religious studies, with a specialist interest in European Romanticism, eco-poetics, and interdisciplinary climate change, disaster, and extinction studies. She's involved in a UK Research and Innovation Research Network on religion and extinction, and the LUCE-funded research network based at Duke University entitled Facing the Anthropocene. She currently resides at FRIAS in Freiburg on a Marie Curie co-funded senior research fellowship, working on a project on religion, resilience, and the multi-species city, as part of the FRIAS focus on resilience in the environmental humanities. And I'll end her with these many, many achievements. And just want to say, Kate Rigby is an outstanding expert in many specialized areas of the environmental humanities, but she moreover is an inspiring example for academics because of her ability and willingness to work in inter and transdisciplinary contexts of many kinds. And as everybody who's had the exceptional pleasure of working with her, and even those who've only spoken with her, listened to her present her work, can certainly confirm she's an inspiring, eloquent, and absolutely impressive human being. To be around such a wonderful person is invaluable in this event's context of research and teaching on well-being, and it's a personal reason for joy. Dear Kate, thanks so much for joining us today. We are all extremely thrilled to have you and to listen to you present your work. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Roman, and indeed Sylvie, for this invitation. I've decided to focus my title in such a way that I think it's going to be particularly apposite for the EUniWell FestiWell on the question of well-being in a more than human world. And I'm going to begin with a warning: mind the gap. Well, this is a warning that I'm sure we've all heard in many different languages on various train journeys, but the gap that I'm talking about is rather bigger than the one between the train and the platform edge. And it's more sinister. It's perhaps more like this gap, or indeed this one. In fact, it is the sustainability gap, so called by the authors of an article that appeared in 2007, who were concerned to address the widening gap between our current trajectory and meaningful environmental sustainability targets. Well, sad to say, in the intervening years, that gap has continued to yawn ever wider, as indicated by several environmental indicators, such as greenhouse gas emissions and global heating, ocean acidification, toxic pollution, marine plastics, nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, biodiversity loss, novel pathogens. And all of these and others, of course, have grave social and economic consequences. So in the light of this sustainability gap, the authors of this article recommend two overarching agendas. The first is to reconceive sustainability as a hierarchy of considerations, with the biophysical limits of the Earth setting the ultimate boundaries within which social and economic goals must be achieved. The second is that transdisciplinary research programs must confront key normative questions facing modern consumer societies. The humanities should have a key role in such programs. Well, this modest article in Trends in Ecology and Evolution actually represents a landmark in the emergence of the inter and transdisciplinary field that has since become known as the Environmental Humanities. The article arose from a workshop at the Australian National University Centre for Resource and Environmental Studies. And among its co-authors were historians of science and environment, Libby Robin, and environmental anthropologist, Deborah Bird-Rose. Now, back in 2001, Rose and Robin, together with environmental historian Tom Griffiths and environmental lawyer Tim Boney-Hady, had initiated Australia's working group on the ecological humanities. Other founding members of this network included cultural theorists, eco-philosophers, and indeed myself, representing literary studies, with strong support from the directors of CRESS, the ecologist Robert Wasson, and the very noted climatologist Will Steffen. Well, this article embodies our recognition that closing the sustainability gap necessitates bridging the disciplinary divide. Human action in the world emerges from a complex dialectic among the living world itself, the social context of human life and action, and the conceptualizations through which human life is made meaningful. Fundamentally enhanced collaboration among natural and social scientists and scholars of human context, symbols, and meanings would signal the beginning of a new paradigm for addressing the sustainability gap. And this is, in fact, the project of the Environmental Humanities. As Robert Emmett and David Nye observe in their critical introduction to the field, because of its wide range, the field of environmental humanities is difficult to pin down, and it has different profiles depending on the scholarly strengths at the institutions where it has emerged. Australia's National Working Group on the Ecological Humanities was an institutional initiative, and it was one of several groupings that formed the seedbed for the environmental humanities globally. Another was the Nordic Network for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies, which got underway in 2007. Researchers from which have since developed a wonderful digital resource for public-facing environmental humanities called Bifrost. More recently, the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society was founded in 2009 as a joint initiative of Munich's Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität and the Deutsches Museum, with funding from the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research as a Kita Hamburger colleague. It's become an international powerhouse for the environmental humanities in Europe, having branched out from its original focus on environmental history to include other environmental humanities and social science disciplines. And the Rachel Carson Center's portal is an invaluable resource for environmental humanities research and public engagement. With the creation of a number of Humanities for the Environment observatories around the world, with generous funding from the Mellon Foundation between 2013 and 2015, it was clear that the environmental humanities was set to take off globally. In addition to the original trio of European, North American, and Australia Pacific observatories, there are now Humanities for the Environment observatories for Latin America, East Asia, Asia Pacific, Africa, and even the circumpolar region. Meanwhile, academic positions, professorships, and teaching and research programs are beginning to sprout in many countries. So broadly speaking, the environmental humanities are concerned with the dynamic interrelationship of human cultures, other than human beings and processes, and the environments that we shape and that shape us. In the first issue of the Environmental Humanities Journal, Rose and her young co-editors, all of them incidentally former PhD students and founding members of the Australian Eco-Humanities Working Group. These editors describe the environmental humanities in this way. Drawing on humanities and social science disciplines that have brought qualitative analysis to bear on environmental issues, the environmental humanities engages with fundamental questions of meaning, value, responsibility, and purpose in a time of rapid and escalating change. At the core of this approach is a focus on the underlying cultural and philosophical frameworks that are entangled with the ways in which diverse human cultures have made themselves at home in a more than human world. I like to think of the environmental humanities as an interdisciplinary endeavour woven out of the varying combinations of green threads that had appeared within discrete humanities and humanities-leaning social sciences from the 1970s, several of which I've mentioned already: environmental history, law, philosophy and ethics, anthropology, environmental literary, visual and cultural studies. In addition, there are ecolinguistics and biosemiotics, political ecology, environmental or more than human geography, and environmental religious studies and ecotheology. But as Rose and her co-editors highlight, recent interest in the environmental humanities as a field and a label is a result of something more than the growth of work within a range of distinct disciplinary areas. Rather, the emergence of the environmental humanities indicates a renewed emphasis on bringing various approaches to environmental scholarship into conversation with each other in numerous and diverse ways. And there are intersections also with other interdisciplinary fields, such as science and technology studies, critical animal and plant studies, gender and queer studies, and post-colonial studies. Well, in our enthusiasm back in 2002, the Australian Ecological Humanities Group released a manifesto for the ecological humanities, which you can still find on the Fenner School website. In their introduction to the ecological humanities, an invitation to the ecological humanities in action in the Australian Humanities Review in 2004, Rose and Robin weave a narrative around this manifesto, saying the ecological humanities works across the great binaries of Western thought. We work in a time of rapid social and environmental change and are committed to cross-cutting the divides that impede our understanding and action. This commitment has a parallel in our work towards social and ecological justice and the future of life. Those of us settler society scholars have another ethical imperative here: to be responsive to Indigenous peoples' knowledges and aspirations for justice. The ecological humanities thus engage with connectivity and commitment in a time of crisis and concern. Well, 2 decades later, in it's not 2 decades later, it's 1 decade later, I'm ahead of myself, 1 decade later, in another landmark article in the Environmental Humanities and Social Sciences, Noel Castry and his large cast of co-authors, including several from the Australian Eco-Humanities Working Group, sought to introduce a largely scientific readership to the environmental humanities in this way. Research in the environmental humanities addresses fundamental questions of value, responsibility, rights, entitlements, needs, duty, faith, care, government, cruelty, charity, and justice in a world marked firstly by significant differences in people's customs and aspirations, secondly, manifest inequalities in people's living conditions and material prospects, and thirdly, complex material and moral interdependencies among people and non-humans stretched across space and unfolding through time. The environmental humanities illuminate people's complex and divergent understandings of life, human and non-human, on Earth. They also pay close attention to human faculties beyond cognition and reason, dealing with such things as love, trust, fear, care, commitment, devotion, and loyalty. Published in Nature Climate Change, this short perspectives article is concerned to highlight the general lack of humanities and qualitative social science input to global environmental change research and policy development. We argued that such research, conducted almost exclusively by natural and quantitative social scientists, this research in global environmental change offers little or no sense of humans as diverse, interpretive creatures who frequently disagree about values, means, and ends. And there's no mention of power, violence, inequality, and the perennial desire of some people to replace one socio-environmental regime with another. So the article was really a pitch for what the environmental humanities and social sciences could contribute in engendering a more complex and nuanced understanding of the human dimensions of global environmental change. Well, some international reports are certainly beginning to gesture towards sociocultural factors. For example, the IPCC synthesis report from 2014 says, vulnerability to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and the capacity for adaptation and mitigation are strongly influenced by livelihoods, behavior, and culture. More fulsomely, a report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services from 2018 observes collective systems of knowledge, norms, values, and beliefs, which in turn guide cultural governance and land management practices, as well as resource use and consumer behaviors, constitute a worldview. When dominant or mainstream perceptions and concepts have an undesired impact on nature and its contributions to people, promoting alternative perceptions and concepts may transform practices towards more desired impacts. Policies defending new concepts and associated practices are expected by civil society, the authors write optimistically, as environmental degradation affects human well-being. Yet, humanities scholars in particular remain few and far between in the research groupings that are generating these high-level reports. So Castry's article thus ends with an exhortation to fellow environmental humanists and social scientists to get out of their comfort zones. Scholars who feel they are not part of the GEC conversation beyond their home discipline must break into the relevant meetings, conferences, and journals, which of course was exactly what we were trying to do in getting this paper into a major science journal. So in the remainder of this lecture, I want to introduce you to 3 current research foci within the environmental humanities that I think are particularly pertinent to the concerns of EUniWell. And the first is discussions around nature and well-being, and more specifically, cultures of nature and well-being. Well, this was the name of a UK Arts and Humanities Research Council funded grant held by my colleague at Bath Spa, Samantha Walton, between 2016 and 2018. And these are the 2 books that were some of the outcomes of her marvelous work on this project. Offering unique cultural and historical insights, this project aimed to add new layers of understanding to current research linking nature and well-being, and to demonstrate the dynamic and influential role that arts and humanities research can play in public life. Well, of course, there are long-standing concerns about the adverse mental and physical health impacts of environmental degradation, for example, arising from air, water, and soil pollution, and their inequitable social distribution. Meanwhile, climate change is beginning to drive up illness and mortality in connection with such phenomena as intense heat waves, droughts, fires, and floods. And I note that the UN has just agreed to make a clean and healthy environment a fundamental human right, a significant development. Conversely, there's now a growing body of empirical evidence for the health benefits of time spent in green and blue spaces, sometimes referred to as therapeutic landscapes, whether leafy city parks, woodlands and meadows, rivers, wetlands, or beaches. There's also growing recognition that more domestic forms of engagement with nature, such as gardening, caring for indoor plants, and of course, interacting with companion animals, can yield health benefits. Such benefits are many and vary depending on the place and type of activity, but they include lowering blood pressure, improving cognitive function, boosting immunity, aiding recovery from illness, and relief from feelings of stress, anxiety, and depression. In some parts of the UK, the National Health Service is beginning to practice green social prescribing, especially for patients with mental health problems. Meanwhile, the British Wildlife Trusts, in association with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and a number of other partner organisations, are advocating for a Nature and Wellbeing Act to inscribe restoration of nature and equitable access to therapeutic landscapes into law. And this is something that has been taken up in the UK government's 25-year plan to improve the environment. Yet the premise of Sam's study is that the links between nature and well-being are not straightforwardly physiological, but highly context dependent and entwined with a raft of social and cultural factors, which include accessibility. For example, in the UK, with the defunding of rural bus services, you need a car and money for petrol to access most national parks. In addition to resources, you also need time, and those with limited mobility need special equipment to get around in these places. Some may have safety concerns. Being out in nature alone might be a source of anxiety for many, including many women. And for those who are anxious about unfamiliar and potentially or seemingly dangerous biota. Now, admittedly, this is probably more of a problem in the Australian bush than in English woods. Although I must say our young son did once almost tread on not one, but two adders on one of England's last remaining meadows. In addition, there are attitudes and values. In European culture, the quest for the nature cure, as Sam points out, might be traced right back to classical Greek and Rome, as evidenced, for example, in the pastoral literature of Theocritus and Virgil. And this tradition got a modern reframing during the Romantic period in the face of the beginnings of fossil-fueled industrialization. Yet many people in the UK and elsewhere in Europe today do not share this particular heritage. Whether for reasons of access or attitude or a combination, a 2019 report by Natural England found that 70% of children from a white background spent time outside once a week, compared to only 56% of children from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. While a similar study of nature engagement among adults showed that 25% of BAME adults over the age of 16 never visited a park or other natural site, or did so less than once a month, compared to only 18% of the white population. And in fact, one of the particularly inspiring people who took part in Sam's research was a British Bangladeshi schoolgirl, whom some of you may have heard of, Maya Rose Craig, who was so troubled by the view that she found was widely shared among her minority ethnic school friends, that the countryside was a white preserve. They simply didn't feel comfortable there. They didn't feel that they belonged. That she started an initiative, this is at age kind of 14 or 15, she started an initiative called Black to Nature to get them out into the countryside and nature camps. So Sam's argument is that the nature and well-being link needs to be viewed through an intersectional lens: race, gender, wealth, ethnicity, and disability. But her work also probes deeper questions and connections. After all, we wouldn't be talking about well-being if we were not in the midst of a crisis of unwellness. We need to look long and hard at the causes of this rather than just rush off to find a band-aid by the beach. Sam says, we are living through a crisis of mental health, social injustice, and environmental devastation, which are all terrible on their own and inextricably entwined. Consider poor diet, pollution, overwork, underpay, uncertainty, inequality, a glut of stuff combined with a dearth of meaning, endless distraction, yet little restorative leisure. All these sources of ill health are also drivers of ecological and climate crisis. Is it not profoundly ironic that medical researchers, institutions, and the wellness industry, because there's money to be made here too, should be advocating a nature cure when nature itself is so badly in need of healing? Take the UK once again. A new study has confirmed that the UK, and especially England, is one of the most nature-denuded countries on the planet, having lost half of its biodiversity since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and with 1 in 7 of surviving species at risk of extinction. Telling an English teenager in the grip of eco-grief to take a walk in the woods might well rub salt in the wounds, reminding them of all that they will no longer encounter there, such as nightingales and cuckoos, hedgehogs and dormice, all are disappearing from the English countryside. Moreover, valuing green and blue landscapes as a resource for exclusively human well-being, a panacea for problems often entangled with environmental degradation, risks perpetuating an instrumental view of the natural world as a service provider for the planet's sovereign species, a view which has arguably contributed to getting us into this mess. So in order to counter this tendency, I think, we need to reconceive well-being as a multi-species project. And in this, I think it's very helpful to consider Indigenous perspectives. So the notion that you can consider human well-being in isolation from the flourishing of those many non-human others with whose lives our own are entangled is a nonsense from the perspective of many Indigenous cultures around the world. And this is certainly the case in Australia, where caring for country is core to Aboriginal understandings of what it is to be human, of what constitutes a meaningful human life. That is ensuring that your ancestral lands and waters remain vibrantly alive and conducive to the interconnected flourishing of all the mobs, human and otherwise, who coexist there. Aboriginal scholar and activist Eileen Morton Robinson writes in her book, The White Possessive, our ontological relationship to land, the ways in which country is constitutive of us, and therefore the inalienable nature of our relation to land, marks a radical, indeed incommensurable difference between us and the non-Indigenous. And in her discussion paper on Aboriginal social and emotional well-being, Aboriginal scholar Victoria Greaves highlights the importance of interpersonal relations with and responsibilities towards both human and non-human kin, and the centrality of the praxis of caring for country to Indigenous health. And this connection is foundational for the remarkable Indigenous Ranger program called Country Needs People, Protecting Nature, Transforming Lives, on Australia's extensive and growing Indigenous protected areas. Those ochre blocks are all existing in Indigenous protected areas, and the amber dots are consultation areas, and the red dots are new Indigenous protected areas. So it's actually a significant part of Australia that is being cared for by Indigenous people. Well, Deborah Bird Rose's long-time work with Indigenous communities in Northern Australia, as embodied in her book, Dingo Makes Us Human, work which included providing expert witness in legal proceedings related to native title claims, contributed to the development in Australia of the field of multi-species ethnography. In their introduction to a 2010 special issue of cultural anthropology on multi-species ethnography, Eben Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich explain, multi-species ethnography centers on how a multitude of organisms' livelihoods shape and are shaped by political, economic, and cultural forces. Multi-species ethnographers are studying contact zones where lines separating nature from culture have broken down, where encounters between Homo sapiens and other beings generate mutual ecologies and co-produce niches. And those contact zones are everywhere, from the biota in our guts, our little messmates, as Donna Haraway refers to them because they eat with us, to the animals, plants, and fungi that we rely upon for food and materials and other ecosystem services, to the plants and animals that we admire from afar or consider companions, kin, or workmates. In their exploration of the entangled life stories of humans, flying foxes, and penguins in Sydney, Rose and Tom van Doren reimagine the city as a locus of multi-species conviviality, understood as a kind of being together that's not reducible to shared identities, but rather a practice of temporary identification with others in a shared place. Mindful of the distinct worlds of meaning inhabited by different species, Rose and van Doren stress that identification, in contrast to identity, does not require that we share an essence or even a project, but simply that we are attentive being in a place. They go on to argue that in the context of urban planning, conviviality cannot be engineered, but it can be both accommodated and planned for. Conviviality thus requires that we make an effort towards inclusiveness, that we endeavour wherever possible to make room for that other in our activities in shared places. Rose van Doren and others have brought a multi-species perspective to bear on extinction studies, arguing that extinction is experienced, resisted, measured, enunciated, performed, and narrated in a variety of ways to which we must attend in the guise of extinction stories that are able to disclose the entangled significance of extinction as a biocultural phenomenon. Well, perspectives such as these inform another recent FestiWell-based project towards hydro-citizenship, a big AHRC-funded project that ran between 2014 and 2017, led by Owen Jones, an environmental geographer and the UK's first Professor of Environmental Humanities. This project sought to enlarge the concept of citizenship to encompass people's interrelations with the watery places and aquatic species found within and adjacent to several UK project sites, including Bristol. And it involved working with artists, performers, filmmakers, and educators to connect urban communities with their aquatic environs and to foster more convivial, life-sustaining, and life-enhancing relations with their more than human inhabitants. Now, I should stress that none of this presupposes that such relations ever were or could be entirely harmonious. Rivers and seas are not always placid neighbours, as recent flooding in Europe has reminded us, but their propensity to cause trouble has only increased in response to anthropogenic climate change. So this brings me to my final example of environmental humanities research germane to well-being, and this is in fact the territory of my own research over many years, and in particular my 2015 monograph, Dancing with Disaster, Environmental Histories, Narratives and Ethics for Perilous Times. The premise of this book is that no disaster is ever purely natural, and that the modern coinage, natural disaster, is actually impeding our recognition of the human dimensions of those disasters that are now escalating in frequency and intensity around our anthropogenic planet. As anthropologists of disaster, Hoffman and Oliver Smith explain, disasters spring from the nexus where environment, society, and technology come together, the point where place, people, and human construction of both the material and non-material meet. It is from the interplay of these three planes that disasters emanate, and in their unfolding, they re-implicate every vector of their causal interface. So disasters are better understood as socioecological processes, not natural events. This is well recognised in the field of disaster risk reduction. It's reflected in the policy framework, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. But here too, cultural differences differences in framing and hence responding to disaster remain under-acknowledged and under-researched. If, as Anthony Oliver Smith insists, today's disasters are sentinel events of processes that are intensifying on a planetary scale, and in that sense, as I would say, apocalyptic, that is, they are revelatory, then the interpretation of the messages brought by these sentinels remains a crucial issue. So in my view, analysing what I've called the hermeneutics of disaster is a key role for the environmental humanities. And dancing with disaster thus denaturalizes the concept of natural disaster by uncovering the historically contingent and culturally specific assumptions that it presupposes. Arguing for a more complex account of such calamities, I reconstruct the history of a variety of past disasters, from the Black Death of the Middle Ages and a chapter on pandemics that suddenly became very topical last year, to the mega hurricanes and firestorms of the 21st century. These accounts reveal the dynamic interaction of diverse human and non-human factors and actors in their causation, unfolding, and aftermath. Focusing on the link between the ways in which disasters are framed by the stories we tell about them and how people tend to respond to them in practice, I also show how works of narrative fiction can open an ethical space within which to reflect upon the contested meaning of such disasters, as well as disclosing human entanglements at once material and moral with non-human others. I think that the major challenge for educators today is how to prepare young people and their teachers for a perilous future, marked by increasingly frequent and intense extreme weather events, rising social tensions, political and economic disruption, without simply frightening, angering, or depressing them even more. Well, this is something that I've started to explore with colleagues at FestiWell in the Hazards, Risks and Disasters Research Group. And my hunch is that if disaster preparedness conjoined with attention to more than human well-being and multi-species conviviality can be undertaken in an enabling and creative way, this could be exactly what is needed to counter crippling eco-anxiety, potentially contributing to a more positive self-understanding of the human vocation to be custodians, defenders, and restorers of the more than human collective of the living earth. And it's in this spirit that I want to conclude with a poem. Well, I am a literary scholar after all. Before I share this poem with you, though, there is a proviso, because the speaker of this poem uses the first person plural, we, which is something that I always try to avoid, and I always warn my students against using we. So when you hear this poem, I'd like you to think of this we in a very local sense of the we of me and you here now or wherever you are, potentially also our colleagues and students in our respective European universities. So this is not a universal human we, this is a very specific human we. And I might mention also one of the two people it's dedicated to is the whistleblower Karen Silkwood, who is a chemical technician and labour union activist known for raising concerns about corporate practices related to health and safety in a nuclear facility. She died under mysterious circumstances in 1974. So here then is Denise Levitoff's Beginners. And it begins with a rather world-weary quote from Algernon Swinburne. Swinburne wrote, "From too much love of living, hope and desire set free, even the weariest river winds somewhere to the sea." To which the speaker retorts, "But we have only begun to love the earth. We've only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How could we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy, only begun to envision how it might be to live as siblings with beast and flower, not as oppressors. Surely our river cannot already be hastening into the sea of non-being. Surely it cannot drag in the silt all that is innocent. Not yet, not yet. There is too much broken that must be mended. Too much hurt that we have done to each other that cannot yet be forgiven. We've only begun to know the power that is in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. And I'm going to give the very final word to another Australian eco-humanities scholar, the environmental ethicist and psychologist, Glenn Albrecht, who has come up with yet another alternative to the problematic Anthropocene. His is the unashamedly utopian Symbiocene. And so this is what Albrecht says of the Symbiocene. In the Symbiocene, human action, culture, and enterprise will be exemplified by those cumulative types of relationships and attributes that enhance mutual interdependence and mutual benefit for all living beings, desirable, all species, essential, and the health of all ecosystems, mandatory. So let me conclude by wishing you well with your EUniWell Environmental Humanities initiative, in the hope that your endeavours will indeed contribute to exiting the Anthropocene and entering the Symbiocene. Thank you.